Reset everything. Today's video should not be too long, but we need to do it if we want to continue the series, because right now when we end the combat, all the units that were removed from the grid because they died during the combat, they are not coming back on the grid even if we are back in the debug menu, so it's not really possible to continue debugging the game or test any other features. So what we're gonna do is simply take all the units and put them back on the grid and then reset all their stats so we can continue debugging the game. So let's get to it. So in Unreal, since this functionality is mainly for the debug menu, we're not gonna reuse that feature inside the real game because we don't want to reset the grid every time the combat ends. We are only going to do that every time we end a combat that was started by the debug menu. So we're gonna do that inside the debug menu itself, and more specifically inside the tab combat, because this is the tab that is responsible of the combat. I'm gonna go in the graph and create myself two new functions. The first function is going to keep track of all the units that were on the grid at the beginning of the combat, and we're gonna use the second function to reposition all those units back to their original place on the grid once the combat is over. I renamed the first function remember units at beginning of combat, and the second function is named restore units after combat ended. So these are the two functions we're gonna use today, and we also need two new variables to keep track of the variables we want to remember and then reapply at the end of the combat. So variable 1, variable 2. I named the first variable units data to remember, and it is of type BP unit, and it is a mapping from the BP unit to SUnit data structure because we want to remember all the statistics of all of our units. And then the second variable, I named it unit index to remember, and it's the same thing, it's a mapping from the BP unit to an int point this time because we want to remember the position of the unit on the grid, which is an int point. So with those two variables, we now are able to remember the statistic of the units and where they are on the grid. And now it's time to populate those two variables. So let's go in the remember units right here, and what we're gonna do is just take all the units that are on the grid and put them in the variables. But first we want to make sure that the variables are clean. So let's do that. I'm gonna start by clearing my first variable, so unit data to remember. I'm just doing a clear to remove everything that was in there, and then I'm gonna do the exact same thing but for the second variable. So unit index to remember, I'm just going to do a clear on it. And now we're ready to use the variable. So let's do that. The first step is to simply loop through all the units that are on the grid and remember them. So let's start by looping through them. I'm gonna take all the units that are currently in combat in the combat system and loop through each of them. So process them all one by one. And to make it a little bit more clear, I'm just going to promote this into a local variable right here that I named the unit. That way it's going to be simpler to connect to everything else. Perfect. Now we can go to the right a little bit right here to add the unit inside our two variables. So let's start with the unit data. It's super simple. We just have to take the unit data, add inside it, and then we're gonna simply add the unit and its unit data. Here we go, that's done. And then we're just going to do the same thing for the unit index. So let's do an add on the unit index to remember, passing it the unit and the unit index. Here we go. Now we remember everything we need to remember to be able to reset the grid after the combat. Perfect, now the variables contain all the data we need, we just have to go use it to reset the grid after the combat. So let's go inside the restore units after combat ended, and we're gonna restore all the units using our two new variables. And actually here, the first thing I'm going to do is a little bit weird. I'm going to take all the keys of one of our two new variables right here and promote them inside a local variable right here that I named the desired units. And we're going to use that variable when we are processing all the units to decide if we want to keep that unit or not. I know it's a little bit weird right now because we don't have really a possibility to spawn a new unit during the combat. But let's say you did. Let's say you had a spell that spawned a unit in combat. Well, we don't want to keep that unit once the combat is ended. The unit was not there at the beginning. We don't want to keep it after the combat ended. So we're simply going to destroy it in that case. We won't really be able to test it today, sadly, but I still wanted to do it today. That way we don't have to come back later, unless the code is bugged because we didn't test it. And that's a problem for later. So anyway, now we know which units were there at the beginning of the combat, and now we're gonna process all the units that are currently in combat. So let's take them. I'm gonna get them inside the units in combat variable that is inside the combat system, and I'm going to set them inside a new local variables right here that I named the all unit. So these are all the units that are there at the end of the combat. And now we need to process them. So let's do that. I'm gonna loop through all of them with a for each loop and promote the array element inside a new local variable right here that I named the unit, just so it's it's simpler and cleaner to use it. Perfect. Now I'm gonna go on the right here to use that variable, and the first thing I'm gonna do is check to make sure that the unit was already there at the beginning of the combat, because otherwise we don't want to reuse it, we don't want to keep it, we don't want to keep it on the grid. So I'm just going to check inside my desired unit if it contains the current unit. If it doesn't, well, we don't want the unit on the grid anymore, so we're simply going to destroy it. So let's call the remove unit from combat inside the combat system. I'm going to feed it the unit because we want to remove it, and I'm also going to tell it to destroy the actor because we really don't want to keep it. And that's it for the code that we won't be able to test. So, okay, I hope it's not gonna cause any issues in the future. And now it's time to process the units we want to restore. So let's take our unit right here, and in the case that it was there at the beginning of the combat, so if it's part of the desired unit, we're simply going to take the unit and put it back to its original location on the grid. So let's do that. I'm gonna call the function setUnitIndex on grid inside my combat system again. I'm going to feed it the unit we want to move on the grid, and for the index, I'm going to use the index we saved inside the units index to remember. Perfect, so now the unit is back on the grid. Just make sure to check the forced checkbox and also the snap location checkbox. That way the unit is really snapped back on the grid in any scenario. And then we just need to reset the unit's data. So I'm just gonna go on the right a little bit, and I'm simply going to call the setUnitData function right here. I'm going to feed it the data, which is coming from the unit's data to remember right here, feeding it the unit. Here we go. Now the unit data is back to what it was at the beginning of the combat. And there's just one last little thing to do, because right now the unit is back on the grid, it's at the right location, its data is back to normal. There's just one little thing, and it is the animation, because it's possible that the unit died during the combat, or maybe was hit by a spell right before the combat ended or something like that. In those scenarios, maybe the animation is going to be bugged or not back to normal, so let's just reset it to make sure that it is back to normal. So let's just set the animation back to idle. Perfect, now it's done, the units are back on the grid, the data is reset, the animation is good. And the last thing left to do is to call those two functions, so I'm gonna go in the event graph to do that. And we're gonna focus on the callback right here on combat started or ended, right there. And what we're gonna do is either call the first function or the second function, depending if the combat just started or ended. So let's do that. After updating all the button and text, I'm just going to check to see if we are in combat or not. And if we are, it means that we just started the combat. So I'm just going to remember the units at the beginning of combat. And if we are not, well, the combat just ended. So we are just going to restore the unit after combat ended. And that's it. Now we should be able to see a difference. So let's compile, save, and go see how it looks. So here I'm just going to add myself a few units on the grid so we can see if it works. So I'm gonna have a few warrior, a few ranger, whatever, it's not that important. And I'm gonna add a chicken right here so we can kill it easily and see if it resets properly. So I'm gonna move my warrior and try to attack the chicken. Okay, I failed, I can attack it from here. Then I'm gonna move that one and attack the chicken. Okay, it seems to work, I can attack the chicken, so that's good. I'm just going to move my ranger around. I want to also be able to move my chicken before the combat ends, so I'm gonna move it right here. Actually, I'm just going to attack the warrior a little bit to see if its health bar resets properly and its health and everything. So, okay, good. Now I can probably kill my chicken, no problem. So let's kill it. Okay, here we go. Now the combat is over. Let's see what happens when I click on end combat. Okay. The warrior is back to the right place, the other warrior too, the ranger also, that's not an issue, the chicken also, perfect. Everybody's back to the right place. The chicken doesn't seem to have all its HP back, that's weird, same thing for the warrior at the bottom. Okay, that's a little bit weird. At least they are playing the right animation, so that's good. Let's see what happens if I start a new combat and I try to go hit the chicken again. So let's hit it. Okay, its HP is back to normal, it's just that the health bar didn't reset, I think. That's a bit weird, but at least it seems to work, so that's good. And if I try to kill it again, okay, now everybody should reset. Here we go. Everybody resetted except the health bars. So I think it's really a health bar issue. So let's go fix that. And I think it's gonna be inside the BP unit. So let's go in core units and open the BP unit. And here the function we are interested in is the setUnitData function, because if you remember inside the tab combat, that's the function we call when we want to reset the unit data on the unit right here. So we just want to make sure that this function works properly. So let's go back in the unit and let's see what's happening. Okay, here we are setting the data, that's good, the data is back to what we want it to be. So that's good, then we are setting the skeletal mesh and the anime instance. Okay, no change in that. but we never call the callback to notify the rest of the game that the unit stats change, so maybe we should do that, and actually I'm just going to do it. So right here, I'm just going to call the callback call on unit stats change right here. That way, the rest of the game is gonna know that the unit stats just changed because they changed right here. So now that's done. And the second thing we need to do is to update the HP bar, because right now it's never updating itself. So I'm just gonna go at the end right here, and I'm just gonna check to make sure that the HP bar is valid right here, the variable that we have just right here that contains the HP bar. I'm just going to update it in that case. So let's update the HP bar, and now everything should work as expected in game. So let's go see. I'm gonna add a few units on the grid the same way I did before. So a warrior and a chicken. I'm gonna move my warrior, hit the chicken a little bit, then I'm just gonna hit the warrior again just so we can see its HP bar also, and I'm gonna move the chicken just to make sure that the movement still works. So I'm just gonna kill the chicken. Here we go. Now it has 0 HP, that one has 44 HP, and if I end my combat, they are back to full and at the right location. Perfect. And I guess that's gonna be it, because that's the only feature I wanted to do today. But since the video is pretty short and we have a bit more time, I'm just gonna take a little bit time to clean up a few things inside the BP unit. And the thing I want to change is the animated number. So right here, if I do a find in Blueprint, we can see that the function spawn actor BP animated number is called 4 times at 4 places in our code, 3 times in the BP unit and 1 time in the combat system. So let's take a look at them. I'm gonna take a look at this one. So the HP right here. We can see that we are spawning an actor, the BP animated number, feeding it the location, the number, the color, whatever. I think it's a little bit annoying that we have to do all that, and we should just call one specific function that is responsible to spawn this actor instead. I'm gonna take a look at the other ones though. So in the SetCurrentHp, we are doing the exact same thing, and then in this SetCurrentHp, we are doing the exact same thing. And actually, I think it's the same thing in the combat system. So let's take a look right here inside the function unreached new tile right here. We can see that we are doing the exact same thing. So what I'm going to do is just collapse this inside a function in the BP unit so we can call it more easily. So let's go back in the BP unit. I'm just going to collapse those inside a function, but before doing that, I'm just going to create myself a little reroute node just right here, just so the input is created for me. So new reroute node, I can move the difference on the side right here, and then I can just select those 2 nodes and collapse them into a function. So collapse to function, and we can see that both variables are connected automatically. I can just rename it spawn animated number just like that. And then we can just reassign the color just so it makes sense. And the color, since we are in the SetCurrentHp right here, should be the color blue, because that's the color we assign to the action point. Perfect. Now we're gonna do the same thing in all the other places. So let's go in the unspell animation it tile right here. We are spawning an animated number. We don't need to do that anymore, so I'm just going to delete all that and replace it with the new function. Reconnect it like so right here and right there. Here we go. We can connect the number, and for the color, since we are modifying the HP, I'm just going to make it red. Perfect. Now let's go do the same thing in the movement point. So SetCurrentHp, I'm just going to delete this, delete the get actor location, connect the new function just like that. Connect the difference, and also change the color to be green this time because it's the movement point. Perfect. So now we're done with the units. I'm just gonna go do the same thing in the combat system. So let's open the combat system and go in the function on unit reach new tile, and instead of doing all that, I'm just going to call the new function. So spawn animated number. Here we go. Now I can just connect it at the beginning like so. I'm gonna connect the number just like that, and since this function is related to the movement point, I'm just going to change the color to green. Here we go. So now we're done with this, and it's a bit more clean. Good. Now I'm just gonna go see in this function to make sure that it is connected properly, because we created the function automatically with Unreal. So let's go see in there to see if it makes sense. And yeah, it makes sense because it's pretty simple. So Unreal didn't have any problem creating it. And now the next thing I want to do, if we go back in the SetCurrentHp function, we can see that right here we are checking to make sure that the difference is not equal to 0 before spawning the number, because we don't want to spawn a 0, it will not make sense. And we are doing the same thing in the SetCurrentHp. We are checking to make sure that the difference is not equal to 0. So instead of doing it everywhere we are calling this function, I'm just going to move it directly inside the function. So let's go back in the spawn animated number and just add the comparison right here. So if the number we receive is not equal to 0, let's just spawn the actor, otherwise we're not going to do anything. That just makes sense. And then we can go back in the other 2 functions and remove the comparison. So I can remove the difference not equal to 0 right here in the SetCurrentHp, and I'm going to do the same thing in the SetCurrentHp. Let's remove the comparison and just reconnect the show number like so. And there's just one last little thing that I want to do in today's video, and it is inside the SetCurrentHp function. So if we go in there, we can see that we don't have the possibility to spawn an animated function, an animated number for this one compared to, let's say, the SetCurrentAp. At the end, we are spawning the animated number. Same thing for the SetCurrentMp, but in the function SetCurrentHp, we don't have that possibility. We don't have the input as input, and we're never calculating the difference and anything. So let's modify this function just so it's the same as the other one. I think it just makes more sense, and it's going to be a little bit cleaner in my opinion. So let's go at the beginning of the function. We're just going to start by adding ourselves a new input. So the new input, a boolean to decide if we want to show the number or not when we call this function. And then the second thing we need is the difference to know which number we want to spawn on the animated number. So let's just calculate it at the beginning the same way we did in the other ones. So compare the HP with the current HP and set the difference inside a local variable that I have right here. Now we have the two inputs we need to be able to spawn the animated number. So I'm just going to go at the end of the function right after the callback. We're going to decide, okay, do we want to show the number? And if so, we're simply going to spawn the animated number, passing it the difference and also the red color because we are in the HP function. And actually in this case, since the HP bar needs to also be updated every time we are spawning the animated number, I'm just going to update it right here because I think they're pretty much linked together. So let's update the HP bar after spawning the animated number if we wanted to show the number. Perfect. So now that's done. This function is the same as the other one and I think it makes more sense. And now I'm just going to go inside the modify current HP to be able to feed the show number to my set current HP. So I'm just going to reconnect my variable right here. So now we can modify the current HP and decide if we want to show the number. And there's just one place today that I want to modify to use this new feature, and it is where we are respawning the unit in the event graph. So let's go in the event graph right here. In the debug respawn, after a few seconds we are setting the current HP. In this case I'm going to show the number because I think it's going to be more interesting, and it's also going to automatically refresh the HP bar, which means that we don't need that little piece of code right here. So let's just delete that and then we can compile and save, and I think that's gonna be it for today. Let's just go in game and see and make sure that we didn't break anything. So here the first thing we have to check is the respawn feature. So let's go back in our spell and just cast some spells in the debug menu. So right here I'm just gonna kill my units and make sure that they respawn properly. So my chicken respawned plus 10 HP, so that's good. And these two, if I kill them, okay, the bat is respawning plus 15 and the warrior respawns plus 50. So good, that works. The other thing is just we want to make sure that we didn't break the in-game combat overlay. So I'm just going to do some damage to my units just to test something that we didn't test today. So let's just do some damage. Let's remember those numbers. So 8, 35, 8. These should be the numbers that we want to display once the combat ended. So let's just start a combat right here. I'm gonna move my chicken and hit the bat a little bit and then move the chicken far away. It doesn't really matter. Then I'm gonna move the bat, hit my warrior. Why not? So here we go, that's done. I can move the bat and then I can just move the warrior for fun. Why not? Now at any time I can stop the combat. So end combat, and we can see that the HP's values are just reset the same way they were at the beginning of the combat. So 8, 35, and 8. We can see that it works properly, and you can do that as many times as you want compared to before that you had to always stop the game and restart the game, stop the game, restart the game if we want to try multiple scenarios. So now it's working, and it should be way easier to test multiple scenarios because you don't have to stop the game every time. Perfect. So I guess that's gonna be it for today, and I'm gonna see you in the next one. So bye bye.